Welcome back to part 4 of my Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy series. This is also the final video in the series, where we'll conclude the story as well as discuss the gameplay, sound design, and bonus content within the game. In the last video, we left off with Lady Hellbender agreeing to join the Guardians in their fight against the Universal Church of Truth, so let's pick up there. Now back on the Milano, the team enjoys their victory and gears up for the battle ahead. Rocket even asks to borrow Peter's cassette player, something he reluctantly agrees to. From here, we head back to Sacrosanct to finish the church once and for all. When we arrive, we can see that the church still has overwhelming forces, and that Lady Hellbender hasn't shown up yet. The Guardians start to worry that she'll stand them up, but luckily Rocket has a plan. He appears outside the cockpit and says that he's rigged some rockets onto Quill's cassette tape, and plans to release it into space, causing a weird audio disturbance. As he predicted, the cassette tape draws out a lot of the church's forces, allowing us to slowly glide towards Sacrosanct under their noses. Suddenly, the tape is destroyed by none other than Lady Hellbender riding Fing Fang Foom. Now that we have our army, all hell breaks loose, and we get one final flying section as we fight our way towards Sacrosanct. This is definitely the best Milano level too, to the point that I didn't want to leave it. What you're supposed to do here is get to the entrance of Sacrosanct as quickly as you can, but I was having so much fun just flying around and shooting things that I delayed leaving the area for as long as possible to prolong the moment. The church has a ton of ships, so your skills are really tested as far as shooting and evading, and this onslaught of enemies makes for a really fun challenge, especially with the larger ships that have the turrets on them. It was really thematic to fly by and destroy those turrets along the way, so I had a lot of fun with this section. But eventually, we'll land on Sacrosanct where the Guardians leap out sporting their new uniforms. These are the same ones that we found a data file and concept images for in Rocket's room earlier in the game. The suits look great too and definitely make the team look more official. Another detail that showcases their progression as a team is that now whenever you approach an obstacle that a specific Guardian needs to clear, they'll just do it without you prompting them. Usually you need to run up to the barrier and order the proper teammate to clear it. But now everyone knows their roles and they're proactive towards the mission, which I thought was a nice thematic gameplay alteration. From here, Rocket is able to pinpoint Warlock's location with his tracker, so we head to him first. Along the way, Groot gives another comic book reference when Drax asks what beast they should hunt for now that they've beaten Foom.
Groot says Planet X had a really scary monster named Goom.
Ah, a strong name for a terrible monster. The legendary Goom.
Goom is from the comics, originating in Tales of Suspense, known as the Thing from Planet X. Goom likely died during the Chitauri attack, but it's a cool reference nonetheless. We get another fun comics reference when Mantis attempts to reach out to one of the Guardians through the comms.
Bug, you need to be extra careful in the part with all the really big robots. Bug? Oh, that's right. You haven't met Bug in this one. That's a shame. He's really fun.
Bug is a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy in the Abnett and Lanning run, and as his name suggests, he is indeed a humanoid bug. Like Mantis said, he's a fun character, and one that I'd like to see show up in a hypothetical sequel. As we continue to fight through Sacrosanct, Lady Hellbender swoops in above us, showing Star-Lord that she recovered his cassette player. She'll then throw it to him, prompting a quick time event, which if successful, leads to a really badass moment.
Are you gonna be okay?
Yeah. That was just so...
Metal?
However, if you miss the quick time event, things play out much differently.
It's okay. Nothing broken.
You know what I love most about you, Quill?
What?
Your ever-present cat-like reflexes.
As we continue towards Warlock, the team will eventually be swarmed by a dropship, releasing a bunch of possessed Nova Corps. Just in time, a giant beam wipes them all out for us, and we see that it's Cosmo piloting Nowhere's Celestial Head. This could be a nod to the comics, where Rocket pilots the Celestial Head during a battle against the Church. By the way, Cosmo only shows up here if you manage to talk him out of the promise. If you weren't able to, instead what happens is the Nova Corps will drop in similar to before, but this time, Rocket climbs into one of the turret guns. We'll fight against the possessed Nova Corps to buy him some time until he's able to hack into the turrets and use them against them. So a much more combat-oriented encounter and a lot more effort. However, the combat is fun, so that may be a positive. During another combat sequence, Rocket makes another nod to his comic book counterpart.
Like so. Safety inspection! Blam! You failed!
In the comics, Rocket's catchphrase is "Blam, murdered you." He never specifically says that in this game, at least not in my playthroughs, so this is the closest that we get to it. Later, we enter a room containing towers of Inquisitor robots, which are extremely powerful church weapons. We've never fought more than like 2 at once, so this is quite daunting. Surprisingly, but thankfully, this is also the moment that Worldmind warps in. It unleashes a swarm of Nova ships to fight against the church, and then appears before us to tell us to leave.
Guardians of the Galaxy, it is imperative
that you evacuate this vessel
before we fire upon it.
I think that clip gives you a good glimpse at the bossiness of Worldmind and why Nova chose to get rid of his helmet. But anyway, Worldmind wants the Guardians to evacuate because it believes it needs to destroy Sacrosanct. It dials things back when we tell it that Adam Warlock is alive and on board. To aid us, Worldmind uses the Nova Force to deactivate and drop all the robot towers in our way. This gives us an easier path forward, and it's satisfying watching all of these towers plummet. Of course, this only happens if you had a successful conversation with Worldmind earlier, so let's take a look at what happens if you didn't. It begins with us approaching the overwhelming roster of church robots, where the Guardians soon notice the path ahead is blocked by a Faith force field. The Guardians don't really need to beat all these minions, they just need to make it into the next room, so their solution is to just pull out the Faith wires powering the barrier, and escape from there. So like last time, more effort and combat as a penalty for unsuccessful dialogue interactions earlier. However, I do think this highlights the Guardians' ability to think on their feet when faced with an obstacle. Things are easier when they have help, but they still manage to find a solution regardless. In the next room, we find Adam Warlock restrained. The Guardians sneak down and release him, on the condition they work as a team. Warlock agrees, and we continue forward. Together with Warlock, we confront Raker. He quickly traps us in a force field, while Nikki prepares to fulfill the promise. To do so, she releases the power of Magus amongst everyone, encapsulating them in it. In the process, Peter begins to hear Karel's voice, telling him it's time to show Nikki the truth, and to get her to finally accept Karel's death. We then wake back up in Nikki's promise. For assistance, Peter opens the door to speak with Karel. He pleads for her help, but he also has to come to terms with her death himself. She reinforces to him that she's legitimately dead, and that this is merely a fragment of herself that's attached to the Soul Stone. There's also the question of Nikki's parentage. Karel tells Peter that he's not her dad, and that Nikki is instead a war orphan that she secretly adopted on Mercury. Apparently at the time, the Kree Purity Council was rounding up anyone who wasn't full-blooded, and Karel knew that they would kill baby Nikki, so she took her in as her own. This all comes as a surprise to Peter, and the way I interpret his reaction is that I get the feeling he was warming up to the idea of being a dad, and that he might be feeling a slight bit of disappointment at the news.
I couldn't let them kill her.
So I'm not a father.
No. Well, not her father.
Wow. Okay.
Nikki still needs Peter to help her out of the promise, so Karel leaves us to it. Unsure of how to proceed, Peter decides to destroy the promise more literally, by smashing up all the important features in Nikki's hallucination. This triggers her out of the loop, and now we have to do our best to console her. In the process, we can get some really sweet moments between him and Nikki and how they deal with grief.
It's an Earth thing. My mom taught me. The idea is that you light something to remember someone. To pay tribute. I mean, it's not magic or anything. It doesn't bring anyone back, but you know, it's a gesture. A small thing in the face of a very bad thing. Sometimes that's all we have.
Like when we discussed the afterlife with Drax, this was another touching scene and very relatable. Dealing with grief yourself is one thing, but how can you help someone who's going through so much pain, especially someone like Nikki who's still so young? The game simulates this struggle well, providing you with dialogue options that are commonly used in the real world. In this scenario, acknowledging her pain seems to be the best option, versus circling things back to yourself by either stating that you've been there before, or you know what she's going through, which result in harsh responses from Nikki. In the second set of dialogue options, blaming Rocket is definitely the wrong choice, and will cause Nikki to accept the promise.
If you really want to blame someone, you should blame Rocket.
What?
I mean, the bet was his idea in the first place if it traces back to anything.
A bet? You're saying my mom died because you and your buddy decided to—
No, of course not.
Even if the promise isn't real, it's better than whatever this is.
Nikki, no.
In this event, Carell brings you back to the beginning of the loop to try again, until you're able to reach Nikki. With your help, she accepts the death of her mother, acknowledges the falseness of the promise, and decides to make things right. Nikki expels the promise and collapses onto the floor, now with a completely new look, most notably the flaming hair. Just briefly, I want to go over what that means for her, since she's a character from the comics. So prior to the comics featuring the crew of the Guardians that we're most familiar with, there was an earlier Guardians of the Galaxy series that featured a different lineup of characters taking place in the far future. Some of them you might even be familiar with from the movies, the most popular one being Yondu, who was a member of the Guardians team in those early comics. Two other members from this team have also featured briefly in the movies, one of which is Stallone's character, Stakar Ogord, who's known as Starhawk in the comics. There's also Martin X, who's briefly seen in a couple of the movies as well. Nikki is another member in the comics, and she was born on Mercury. The game seems to follow similar origins, since Mercury was where Peter and Carell fought together 12 years ago, so this is where Carell found baby Nikki before adopting her. So Nikki is at least half Mercurian, which is why she has flaming hair, and we'll see her powers a bit later. But first, Raker decides to engage the Guardians in battle, while Warlock takes Nikki's place to begin absorbing Magus back into himself. We need to buy him some time, which leads to our boss fight against Raker. Earlier, if you trusted Gamora to fight Raker alone, resulting in her removing his arm, he'll be weakened during this fight. If you didn't trust her before, you'll have to fight him at full strength. I found him to be a lot more challenging at full power too. He seems to attack more aggressively and has an ability to distort your vision, disabling your ability to command your team's attacks, which is quite debilitating. In both versions, he has quite a lot of health and will periodically shield himself, meaning you have to damage the shield until it's destroyed, and then pour on as much damage as you can in that window. So it can take a while to beat him, and I found him to be quite challenging, especially at full power. It definitely takes the combined efforts of all the Guardians to defeat him, and I thought this was a solid final battle. Once defeated, Raker will collapse onto the ground and Nikki will come over to him. To her, Raker was manipulated just as much as she was by Magus, so she still cares for his well-being. She tells Raker to look up at the Magus' dark energy swirling above them as proof that they were both deceived. What should be a horrifying sight actually seems to bring Raker some joy. It's then when we realize that Raker is dying and that he's not actually seeing what's going on around him, and is instead seeing his dead son once again.
My child. You did it. You brought him back.
It's a bittersweet moment knowing that all his motivation towards creating the Universal Church of Truth was to somehow bring back his son, and it's not until death that he gets his wish. At this moment, Warlock is finally able to reabsorb Magus, clearing the area of its infection. With the galaxy saved, the crew head out to be cheered on by the nearby crowd. From here, the Guardians do a victory lap, embracing the cheers, but also stopping to speak with certain people along the way. First up is Cosmo, if you talked him out of the promise earlier. Cosmo says that he'll offer the Guardians more work in the future, if they're up for it. If you didn't free Cosmo from the promise earlier, he wouldn't have shown up during the battle, so he won't be here to speak with you now. Instead, you'll come across some confused travelers. Warlock mentions that since Magus took over their minds, they don't remember anything after the promise, so they aren't sure where they are. The Guardians tell them they just saved them, confusing them even more, so the Guardians just decide to carry on. Next, we're stopped by Lady Hellbender. Despite the attraction that seems to be brewing between her and Drax, she can't help but flirt with Adam Warlock.
And who is this precious little candy in his golden wrapper?
Ew. Gross.
Wow, Warlock is actually left speechless for once. From here, they ask Lady Hellbender what she'll do now, and she says that she needs to find a worthy home for Foom. We then continue forward to speak with someone else, this time Worldmind, if you were able to convince it to join the battle earlier. The extent of the conversation is mostly Worldmind taking credit for the correct assessment that Warlock would be instrumental in defeating Magus. The Guardians remind it that without them, the Worldmind would have made a terrible decision to just run away.
Your additional
Data analysis did adjust
certain computational.
Ow. You can just feel the world butt clenching.
If you didn't convince Worldmind to join the fight, you'll instead speak with a couple confused Nova Corpsmen, who ask what's going on. The Guardians make a joke about it, stating that it was a galactic party with Drax the Destroyer and Gamora as celebrity guests. Finally, Mantis returns with the Milano to cheer on the team. They all climb aboard the ship, and Peter does some last-minute theatrics, leaving a Guardians of the Galaxy business card behind before boarding. The ship then takes off, and the credits roll. It's not quite over yet though, as the Guardians discuss what to do next. Mantis mentions maybe visiting Earth, which could be a fun nod to the fact that she was a member of the Avengers for a time in the comics. Another fun detail is that during the credits, certain members of the team's names will glitch out and be replaced by Magus, and we get the sense it's still attempting to infect what it can. This is amplified by the game cutting back to Adam on the ship, who seems to be struggling with something. Eventually, Adam is possessed by Magus. As Adam's face is warping to show the Magus taking control, the blackness around his eyes momentarily resembles the shading around his eyes in the comics. Magus then bursts into his final form, a giant version of himself composed of a metallic scaly substance. Magus has a knack for somehow coming back after defeat in the comics too, so this is actually in character for him. Magus plans to destroy the galaxy, so the Guardians are forced to think on their feet. Nikki realizes that Magus has always been afraid of the Soul Stone, which she still has possession of, so they decide to use it against him. But first, they need to lure him in, and their solution is to be as aggravating as possible. For example, choosing to do a slow clap at him. This will trigger him, and he'll throw a whole planet at you. Nikki tells you to trust her, and we see that she has powers of her own, as she makes a protective force field for the Guardians. The Guardians still need to draw Magus closer, so they attempt to provoke him again by making it clear that they won't submit to him. Enraged, Magus will lash out and attempt to attack head-on, prompting Nikki to pull out the Soul Stone. She'll trip and accidentally release it, causing the Guardians to reflexively work together to retrieve the stone. In a way, this is the first time that we get to play as each of the Guardians, performing quick-time events for them to succeed in juggling the stone. It ends up in Peter's hands, so he has to be the one to absorb the Magus into it, at the risk of being killed in the process. We then return to the ship, where it seems to have done just that, until Groot uses his ability to bring Peter back to life. Magus is now trapped inside the Soul Stone, just like in the comics, where he's kept in a realm within the stone called the Soul World. You might recall Soul World from the movies as well, where Thanos briefly interacts with young Gamora. In the game, the team decides to give the Soul Stone to Adam Warlock for safekeeping, since Mantis states that there's a lesser chance of Magus returning if it's in Adam's possession. This also resembles the comics, where Adam keeps the Soul Gem on his forehead. Cammy also gives her approval of Adam by licking him, much to his disgust. But he at least seems to be more accepting of the team now, and it feels like our Guardians roster has grown even bigger. This takes us to a more legitimate end credit montage, featuring some really awesome 80s style graphics to go along with it. There's still one last post-credit scene where we find Peter having a discussion with himself in the mirror, while the rest of the team argue outside about where Nikki's going to sleep on the ship. During Peter's self-talk, we can control how positive or negative he is, as he tries to figure out how to take care of a child on the ship. For those of you that are parents, I'm curious if you've done something similar before.
You can't look after a kid, you are a kid! You should arguably have somebody looking after you!
While Peter is busy hyping himself up, the team decides without him that she'll take his room, and he'll sleep on the couch. Or at least this is what happens if you paid your fine to the Nova Corps. If you didn't pay your fine while the ship is flying, it'll suddenly be deactivated in the middle of space. This closes out the game and brings us to the final credits. Afterwards, we get a where are they now sort of conclusion, describing what the Guardians have done after the game. Most of these are comedic and not too revealing lore-wise, but you can get different ones, so we'll look at how they differ. For example, one has Star-Lord buying new business cards and receiving the key to nowhere from Cosmo for saving the galaxy, although the Guardians just use it to keep the fridge door closed. In my alternate playthrough, I received one stating that Peter started the Rebuild Contraxia initiative and took donations for it. However, the team mostly spent it via gambling and partying. Additionally, Peter talked the Nova Corps into re-enabling the Milano and waiving their fine, but still wound up with a big late fee. So it looks like these can vary depending on your choices in the game. Another example is if Drax threw Rocket in the beginning of the game. Rockets will mention that his contract now states that he's not to be thrown. Alternatively, you can get one where his contract states that he's not to be called cute or adorable in front of clients, likely as a result of doing so in front of Lady Hellbender while trying to sell him. Or for Groot, if you chose to sell him to Lady Hellbender, part of his text will state that he pretends to be the fake Groot occasionally to freak out the team. Then we have Adam Warlock, and his is somewhat interesting since it states that he's back to traveling the galaxy as a healer, attempting to help those who were affected by the promise. But that ends the story of Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. Overall, it'll be no surprise to hear that I thought the writing in this game was absolutely incredible. It's truly impressive how in-depth the writers went for each character, and how much heart they were able to infuse into the storytelling. You expect comedy from something related to the Guardians of the Galaxy, but you don't exactly expect deep drama and emotion. I know the movies often have that too, but from a game, it wasn't what I thought I was walking into, and I was blown away by the deep themes throughout it. For example, the themes of loss and grief, and how to overcome it. Moments where we discussed the afterlife and different cultural beliefs with Drax were really impactful and were some of the most memorable moments for me. The same goes for trying to console Nikki and help her come to terms with losing her mother. Or even Gamora overcoming the fear of being outcasted by the ones she loves for something she did in the past. These are all very relatable, and the strong writing and performances further sell the emotion. Even small details in the game surprise me, like learning that Gamora collects dolls in memory of her sister Nebula, or how Drax's tattoos signify important moments in his life, including the death of his family. Everything in the game is thought out and has meaning, and each character gets equal care and attention. As good as the movies are, this is definitely my favorite interpretation of the Guardians, and I think it seamlessly blends all the best aspects of the movies and comics while bringing extra originality to the team to round things out. I especially appreciate that Eidos Montreal chose to lean into the comic iterations more than the movies, which I think was the right choice, since the movies didn't always get it right. I think the biggest example of that is Drax. In the third movie, they even doubled down on him being a big dumbass, and he's strictly there for comic relief and to occasionally throw a punch. But this is Drax the Destroyer, an intimidating being known across the galaxy as a major threat. I never feel that side of him in the movies and just see him as a doofus. In the comics, he's a skilled tactician and fighter, able to take on powerful foes by himself, not only with his strength and knives, but also with his cunning, and I like that the game makes that distinction. He's literal, which can be humorous, but he's not dumb. Instead, we constantly see him as a thinker, assessing everything around him, as well as his own internal thoughts. We also see him grow. In the beginning, he was wrong in his assessment of Gamora, but over time was able to accept that he was wrong and embrace her as an equal member of the team, later complimenting her and bonding with her through their shared interest in combat practices. This again goes along with the themes of growth, trust, and teamwork throughout the game, which extends to each of the Guardians, but Drax is the biggest standout for me. It's also really impressive how much lore is thought out for this game, not even just for the characters, but also for the worlds and people inhabiting them. There's a ton of backstory sprinkled throughout the game, so much so that you really need to experience multiple playthroughs to uncover it all. Every time I play the game, I feel like I discover something new, or details start to piece together in ways I didn't acknowledge in my last playthrough. The branching narrative helps with that too, as different choices lead to different dialogue between characters, so you're incentivized to play around with different responses. For this video, I did one playthrough where I tried to pick all the correct answers, then another playthrough where I tried to do everything wrong. I also realized that choosing to remain silent has some impact, so I did a partial run where I chose not to speak, just to see how things played out. Usually in bigger moments, silence didn't really benefit me, typically resulting in negative outcomes or skipped conversations, but sometimes I'd hear extra dialogue.
And it dogs adorable.
Quill, make it stop.
When will it reach its big size?
Big size?
It is a baby, is it not?
Oh, it's a baby, all right. Huge baby. Cries all the time.
Ain't a freaking baby.
It is a full-grown hell beast.
But I typically found it better to pick a dialogue option in those moments. However, during moments of normal banter, you get a lot of extra dialogue between the team if you stay silent. Normally, when you select a dialogue choice, Peter interrupts the conversation to interject his thoughts, but if you remain silent, the Guardians will continue to talk amongst themselves, leading to conversations you might not have heard otherwise.
I do not hate everybody.
Come on, Rocket. Drax and Gamora are valued additions to the team.
You're only saying that because she's listening.
Is that why your plan has Drax and I taking the ship?
I do not hate everybody. I tolerate Quill. Quill's a swell guy.
I hope you get that promotion, Rocket.
Are you calling me a bootlicker? I've seen you flatter your way out of Kree custody.
She is winking.
So there are a lot of conversations to be heard in this game, a feature that I actually really like. I've seen the constant banter as a criticism, but I personally view it as a bonus. I like hearing about their lives and the lore of this universe, and the banter often drew me closer to the team, especially since we're given the option to talk with them or choose to just listen to them speak. I found it to be really immersive, and if anything, I wanted more. Overall, it's a very engaging story, and you're only rewarded more for the time you continue to give it, so I really can't praise this game enough. It's funny, it's got heart, and it has a deep lore that you can continuously dig into. I think it 100% deserved the Best Narrative award that it received, and I think it deserves a sequel. Unfortunately, publisher Square Enix reported back in 2022 that launch sales undershot expectations. Rumors suggest that the poor sales were due to its perception of being closely associated with Marvel's Avengers. Avengers received terrible press throughout its lifespan, although I personally enjoyed the game. But some of that negative press might have bled over to Guardians. If true, it's a real shame, and I desperately hope that Guardians' positive critical reception and word of mouth can give it a long tail financially, to keep some of that hope alive for a sequel. Things haven't exactly been looking great though. In May of 2022, Square Enix sold Eidos Montreal to Embracer Group. Then, in early 2024, Eidos had to lay off 97 employees. It was also reported that they were forced to cancel a Deus Ex game that was in early development as well. There was no mention of the Guardians of the Galaxy, although it was said that the studio would next focus on an original franchise. So signs aren't exactly pointing to a sequel, but I'm personally trying to remain optimistic that we'll see it one day, mostly because it's so deserving of one. In my opinion, this is the best written Marvel game currently in existence, and it's my favorite interpretation of the team. So even though there aren't currently any officially released plans for a sequel, I'd like to still take a moment and discuss where the story could possibly go from here based on things that are left open. To start, I feel like Thanos was one of the biggest mysteries left open. Drax makes it very clear that Thanos is alive somewhere in the universe, and I think his reemergence would play a role in a hypothetical sequel. Now, I know in recent years there's been a feeling of Thanos overusage due to his popularity from the films. However, I think Eidos Montreal have the opportunity to utilize him in a fun way, if they're heading in a similar direction as the comics. So during the Annihilation Series, which seems to be an inspiration for this game's narrative, Drax managed to kill Thanos. However, it's later revealed that Adam Warlock found Thanos' body and placed him in a cocoon. The Universal Church of Truth assumed that the cocoon housed their leader Magus, so they kept it at sacrosanct. Later, Thanos emerged from the cocoon, a surprise to everyone since he was believed to be dead. Thanos wasn't the true villain of the story though, since around this time is also when a universe known as the Cancerverse invaded ours. The Cancerverse is a universe where death no longer exists and only life prevails, and without the balance between life and death, things are actually pretty chaotic. Thanos is considered the avatar of death, so he's a crucial ally against the Cancerverse. I'm not saying that the sequel would match this exactly, but I do think there are a couple aspects the writers could use as influence. For starters, maybe Thanos could be in a cocoon somewhere if Adam for whatever reason chose to put him in one. I'm not sure if that all lines up, but really what I'm mostly getting at is that Thanos could return as a needed ally against the wishes of the Guardians. If something like the Cancerverse arose, threatening the galaxy, and Thanos was our only hope, teaming up with him could make for some very interesting character dynamics for the writers to play with. Gamora obviously has a lot of baggage with Thanos, and her portrayal alone would make for some good drama. Then there's of course Drax, who likely hates Thanos the most. Can he overcome his urge to kill him, something he never seems to be able to do in the comics, and what would their interactions look like? Then there's the element of it being Thanos that we're working with, someone who always has ulterior motives and side schemes. So as the player, you'd constantly be trying to assess whether or not he's on your side in that moment or playing you. So I think that could be a really interesting avenue to go down and something the Eidos Montreal writers could do some really cool stuff with. Another aspect of the story that wasn't discussed much was Peter's father, Jay's son. We heard that Spartax was destroyed at one point, but we don't know where that leaves his father. In the comics, Jay's son is actually an adversary to the Guardians and eventually loses his reign on Spartax after being exposed as a villain by Peter. Jay's son later reappears as the villain Mr. Knife, creating a criminal empire and putting a bounty on Peter. At one point, Mr. Knife even approaches Thanos' son, Thane, to join his cause, so that's another element that could be added to a sequel. Still, seeing more of Peter's parentage could be interesting by itself, especially because we spent so much time with Meredith. Plus, Peter's lineage is brought up enough throughout the game that it feels adequately teased. There's also the big mystery of where Nova has gone. He's mentioned often regarding the backstory of the Galactic War since he played a pivotal role in it, the same way he did in the Annihilation series. The fact that Richard has been missing and isn't in contact with the World Mind raises a lot of questions. For this one though, I don't have a solid answer on where he could be. He really could be anywhere. It could be as simple as he's headed to Earth for some reprieve, but I have a feeling it's something bigger than that. So wherever Nova is and whatever he's dealing with, I have a feeling it could play a major role regarding what threat the Guardians would face next. I also wouldn't be surprised to see Yondu show up. We know he's been locked in the kiln and unable to escape, but I expect that with all the craziness of the Promise overtaking the Nova Corps and the rest of the galaxy, that Yondu was probably able to take advantage of the situation and escape. I imagine his first stop would be to track down Peter as revenge for getting him locked up. Whether he would remain a villain or become an ally could be interesting and potentially depend on your dialogue choices, a bit like Lipless. I also think that Nowhere would play a bigger role in a potential sequel, now that we've saved it from the Church and become allies with Cosmo. Nowhere was the base of operations for the Guardians in the comics, so I could see it operating in a similar way in the sequel. The Milano is already overcrowded, even with just Nikki on board, so a bigger area would be appreciated. From a gameplay perspective, I like the idea of walking around Nowhere as our main hub, interacting with an expanded group of Guardians such as Cosmo, Adam Warlock, Mantis, and Nikki, with other members potentially joining the mix as the story progresses. But those are my immediate thoughts on where a sequel could lead us. As it stands, this game ends in a satisfying way on its own, but I think it also left a lot of creative room open for a variety of storylines in a potential sequel, all of which I would be very excited to experience. And I hope to God it gets one, because it absolutely deserves to continue, and I know a lot of people, including myself, would buy it day one. But anyway, I think that wraps up my thoughts on the story and its potential future, so now let's take a step back and talk about how the overall gameplay felt. The combat piggybacks off the teamwork theme and pairs nicely with it. As the leader of the Guardians, you're able to command each member of your team during the heat of battle. The method for doing so is to pull up a selection wheel which features each Guardian, and after selecting one, you can then pick one of their 4 personal abilities. I thought this system, for the most part, was pretty straightforward and felt intuitive enough. Going further into the combat, each Guardian also has a certain specialization that can be strategically used in combat. Drax deals high stagger damage, leaving enemies vulnerable. Gamora is the high damage dealer with her ability to unleash devastating sword slashes. Groot is the support, able to tie up enemies in vines or revive fallen teammates. And Rocket is the explosives expert, unleashing powerful area of effect attacks good for crowd control. So already you likely get a sense of how you can utilize Guardians together for the best results, like stunning enemies with Drax and following up with Gamora for a punishing strike, or having Groot tie enemies in place for Rocket to blow them up all at once. It can be fun to mix and match different abilities, and I like playing around with different combos. Speaking of variety, there's also Star-Lord, who's the jack of all trades. Peter can do a lot of things, but he's not exactly the king of any of them. Still, I like this because even though you have a lot of gameplay options as the player, you're still incentivized to lean into the team aspect. I imagine this was a tough balance for the developers, because you don't want Peter to be so strong that the player can just ignore the Guardians, but you don't want him to be too weak that he feels useless. I think they managed to strike a nice blend though. Using your teammates is definitely the most effective way to win a fight, but Peter still contributes in significant ways. I think the most notable feature are his element guns. Certain enemies are vulnerable to certain elements, meaning it's on Quill to use his guns to weaken them first before he can send in the Guardians. This made big firefights feel tense, as I had to dodge enemies while targeting a specific one in hopes of setting them up for the team. It can feel like there's a lot to juggle during fights, which I think works well in this game as you attempt to control a frantic battlefield. Another aspect to juggle are cooldowns on each of the Guardians. So strong as they are, you might have to wait for that perfect combo to go live again, or try other ones that are available even if they aren't ideal for that moment. If you're in a tough situation where you really need the Guardians firing on all cylinders, you can call a huddle. This will bring all the Guardians together to have a quick strategy discussion, and it's up to you as the leader to listen to what each of them are saying and pick the appropriate motivational speech to get them amped up. If you're successful, everyone's ability cooldowns will be greatly reduced, allowing you to essentially rapid-fire commands across the battlefield, which can be pretty devastating. There are also some thematic changes, such as the Guardians icons changing to a Warcry face, which I thought was cool. Additionally, Star-Lord will play music from his Walkman during the duration of the combat boost, so you can fight to classic 80s songs. However, I didn't always feel like the music matched the tempo of the fight, so some felt a little too slow when I was looking for something high energy for this surge of combat. Nevertheless, another thematic aspect of the huddle is if you give a bad speech to the Guardians. They'll roll their eyes and criticize you before heading back to battle. They won't get any sort of combat boost, but Peter still will, since in his head, he gave an awesome speech and energized himself. It's pretty funny and in line with the character of Star-Lord, so I thought this was a fun detail. As fun thematically as the huddle is, I'm a bit conflicted about its practical use. As powerful as it can be, I still didn't find myself needing to use it that often unless I wanted to expedite a battle against a high health enemy and not wait for cooldowns. If I'm being completely honest, most of the time I used the huddle was by accident. To trigger a huddle on a controller, you'll press the right and left bumpers at the same time. However, the right bumper is used to shoot elements and the left bumper is used for selecting a Guardian to attack. So in fights, it wasn't uncommon for me to accidentally press both at the same time while trying to do multiple things on the battlefield. So a lot of my huddles were unplanned and occurred at unnecessary times. I didn't see an option to remap these buttons either, there might have been one. Regardless, I like to try and stick as close to the default settings as possible for these reviews, since that's what I perceive as the developer's intended settings. Speaking of which, I was surprised at how much you can actually customize the difficulty, since you can log into settings and adjust a variety of gameplay options, such as how much damage Star-Lord's blasters do, how much energy the blasters use each shot, how much damage Star-Lord takes from hits, how long the Guardian's abilities go on cooldown, and a bunch of other things as you can see. At first glance, I felt like this could be dangerous, since the player could accidentally boost Star-Lord to be so strong that the other Guardians are unnecessary. However, from an accessibility standpoint, I like how much flexibility this gives players. For example, Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is a story game at heart, so for players that aren't as practiced with combat or don't care about it, they can customize the combat to their taste. On the flip side, players that have beaten the game a couple of times or are just naturally looking for a greater challenge can further control how they test themselves and where. so I thought it was really cool how much customization is available regarding the difficulty. Overall, I thought the game's combat was well balanced, and I think it succeeded in nailing the leadership and teamwork vibes. I definitely felt like the shot caller on the field, and it was fun seeing my plans come together, and when things weren't going well, I felt the pressure to regroup and try new tactics. Star-Lord himself is fun to control as well, and I like how agile and zippy he is with his jet boots. I enjoyed flying around the field, issuing commands, and peppering enemies with my blasters. So there wasn't really an aspect of the combat that I didn't like, and I think it aided the concepts of the story well. That being said, I'm still left with the feeling of wanting more from the combat. It's weird because although I enjoyed it, I still felt like there was some element of excitement missing from encounters. Some of it could be repetition, since I felt like I could often get by doing similar combos with my Guardians, and didn't feel a need to explore all of their abilities. I think some of the bigger enemies felt tedious too, since they mostly had large health bars, so I was just whittling away at it, waiting for my Guardians to cool down before hitting them with a big attack again. If this game ever received a sequel, I think the combat would be a good area of opportunity. I'm not trying to knock it, since it's fun as it stands, but it feels mostly like a good starting point to build on. In this hypothetical sequel, I'd like to see the combat enhanced, maybe with additional ability options, so that we can customize our Guardians, or maybe more varied enemy types that require me to approach them in different ways. There are already a lot of enemy types in the game, but only a few of them had me really thinking about how to strategically take them down. For reasons I mentioned earlier, I think the Milano's gameplay is another great area of opportunity. Letting us pilot the ship was a great idea, but I really craved more open areas to fly around and shoot enemy ships, since there were only a couple levels we could do that in the story, and even then it was pretty short-lived. So my criticism is mostly just that I would want more Milano in a sequel. Give me some good open areas and space to fly around and a lot of enemies to shoot and evade. I'd also like to see more weapons in the Milano. Not a lot, but just a couple more to give it some extra combat variety. As I mentioned earlier though, I recognized that the Milano could have been totally cut from this game and we wouldn't have known the difference, so I'm happy that it's here at all, but now that I've got a taste for it, I'd really like more. To sum up my thoughts on the gameplay overall though, I think it was solid and innovative, but didn't quite stand up to the heights of the story. Obviously that's a very high bar, but if Eidos Montreal ever did a sequel, I'd really like to see them find ways to elevate the combat. I think they have a great foundation to build upon, and if they could find a way to make the combat really exciting, that, combined with their strong storytelling, truly could make it a contender for Game of the Year. But next, I want to continue forward and discuss the collectibles in the game. I always like games with multiple collectibles because I think it's a great way to incentivize the player to explore each level thoroughly instead of just run through it. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is a great one to explore too because of the rich creativity in each level's design, so I was happy that the game encouraged exploration with hidden areas that rewarded different collectibles. Let's start with Scrap, since that ties in with the combat and gameplay the most, and it's the one you'll most frequently come across. All throughout the game, you'll find a bunch of tech lying around that Rocket can repurpose at a workbench to build you upgrades. I love this because I tend to explore every nook and cranny of a game's environment, and since tech is so abundant here, my exploration was almost always rewarded. However, I wish there were more upgrades to purchase, especially with a New Game Plus in mind. If you're exploring regularly, you'll likely acquire all the upgrades by the end of the game. Once you do that, finding tech is useless and no longer exciting for the final couple of levels of your first playthrough, but even worse, the entirety of a New Game Plus run. Having more upgrades at the workbench in general, or even New Game Plus exclusive upgrades, could keep the hunt exciting throughout multiple playthroughs, and make me weigh which upgrades to prioritize over others. If not more upgrades, I would have at least appreciated something to spend my excess tech scraps on. Like for example, maybe some sort of in-game store for things like concept art or costumes, or maybe visual customizations to the interior of the Milano. Those are mostly just random ideas, but my main point is that I felt like tech very quickly became irrelevant, and I would have liked a reason to continue collecting it in the late game levels, and especially New Game Plus, instead of just stockpiling endless amounts of it. While we're discussing the workbench, I also think there's room for more exciting upgrades. Let me start by saying that none of the upgrades are bad and I found a use for each of them, but I never found one that really excited me. Usually in games there are a couple where I'm like, oh, I've gotta have that. Here it was more like, oh yeah, that could be cool. I think the reason I felt that way was because none of the upgrades really altered Star-Lord's gameplay in an exciting way. There are some cool things like slowing down time with a perfect dodge or increasing your health and shield percentages, but nothing too significant. The closest upgrades were things like Charge Shot, where you could charge up a blast to deal both stagger and normal damage, and the Rapid Reload ability, allowing you to negate the gun's cooldown period while also firing an extra shot. Rapid Reload you get for free though, so you'll have that pretty early on. And Charge Shot unfortunately wasn't that useful to me. Waiting to charge up the shot felt too slow, and I usually found it better and more enjoyable to keep shooting like normal and utilize the Guardian's abilities. So I really only used Charge Shot if all my cooldowns were active and I really needed an extra way to do stagger damage. My point being that these weren't enough. If I had to speculate, I'd guess that it goes back to my compliment that Eidos Montreal found a great balance between Star-Lord being fun to play, but not so strong that he overshadows the need to use the Guardians. Giving him any kind of damage buff or some kind of standout ability might have felt risky in maintaining that balance. Keeping that in mind, my suggestion for extra perks would be to maybe lean into the element guns and change some of their effects. For example, using the same functionality of the charge shot, maybe now you can shoot a spread of ice or wind at an enemy for crowd control, or maybe include upgrades that allow you to swap between how an element is unleashed. For example, while using the fire element, instead of just shooting fireballs, maybe you can unlock a flamethrower ability, similar to the one used in Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3. Again, I know these are kind of shallow suggestions, but I'm mostly trying to illustrate that I felt that the perks needed some extra oomph, but also that I acknowledge that Peter can't be too overpowered. Still, I'd like for Eidos Montreal to find a way to meet somewhere in the middle if they ever have the opportunity to take another crack at it. Moving on to another type of collectible that you can find, there are also data logs. I think this was another fun idea and helped flesh out the universe. Some of these were really interesting, especially ones that featured characters that we've met in the game, such as files regarding Ruby Thursday and her illegal operations with Lipless. Most of them, however, I felt weren't quite as informative. Speaking generally, a lot of them featured characters we've never met and their experiences regarding similar events that we've encountered in the game, which in itself isn't a problem since I really wanted more lore and backstory in this universe. However, I felt like I didn't get much from them. When reading the files, I was mostly hoping to get new information. Instead, a lot of them retread details I was familiar with, but in more detail from the perspective of another character. When I first played this game at its release, I read a few of these when I found them in-game, and then slowly started to ignore them, telling myself I'd just read them later, and I never did it. I imagine other players did the same, dismissing them as too long without much payoff. Now, it could just be that I was looking for deeper story details and background lore to flesh out the universe, while the purpose of the data files was just to provide different perspectives. To other players, that might even be more enjoyable. So I don't want to dismiss these files altogether, but I do want to critique them and suggest that they could be used to greater effectiveness. The writing is so strong in this game that the data files feeling ignorable is a problem to me. But next, let's continue on to our last collectible, character outfits. As you progress the game, you'll find hidden paths, some of which contain a costume for a specific Guardian. These were always exciting to find, and all of them look really detailed. Some of them even change the look of Star-Lord's helmet. I also love that they're visible during all the cutscenes, further adding to the immersion. A few of them even belong to the same set, so you can have a matching team. For example, the outfits from the first movie. There's also an original design featuring the Guardians all wearing Nova Corps suit, which was actually cooler than I expected. There's also the Age of Apocalypse suits, which aren't actually from a comic series, but instead a variant cover imagining what the Guardians would look like if they were Horsemen of Apocalypse. These were some of my favorite outfits in the game, since I love the devilish designs for each of them. Not each of the suits are part of team sets though, so let's next look at each Guardian's wardrobe of unlockable outfits, as well as their comic roots. We'll start with Star-Lord since he has the most outfits available, beginning with the Warlord outfit, which is from Star-Lord's Annihilation Conquest series. This was a pretty important comic for Peter because it marked his reintroduction as Star-Lord. Following the Annihilation wave, a new threat emerged, one that Peter accidentally helped to set in motion. The Kree ordered Peter to fix the problem and assigned him a ragtag group of prisoners to aid him. These prisoners were Rocket, Groot, Mantis, Bug, Captain Universe, and Deathcry. This series would ultimately lead to the 2008 Abnett and Lanning Guardians of the Galaxy run featuring the Guardians as we know them today. Which brings us to our next outfit, which is Star-Lord's Team Lord suit from that series. Those comics were a big influence on this game, so it's one that I'd recommend checking out if you're wanting more from these characters and looking for a good place to start. Speaking of starts, that brings us to the Space Lord suit, which is from Peter's first ever comic origin in 1975's Marvel Preview number 4. If you decide to check out that comic, I will warn you it is a very different Peter Quill than we're used to today. For starters, his mother was still Meredith Quill, but his father wasn't an alien, instead a human named Jake. When Peter was born, Jake insisted that Meredith cheated on him and that the baby didn't look anything like him. Sounds like an episode of Maury, but it's worse, because Jake then took Peter outside and grabbed an axe, presumably to kill him, before Jake suddenly had a heart attack and died on the spot. Years later, Peter and Meredith spotted a UFO. The aliens panicked and killed Meredith before flying off. Wanting revenge, Peter later joined NASA, becoming an astronaut, and he was eventually sent to a space station. While there, the crew were greeted abruptly by a cosmic entity telling them to choose one of their own to become a Star-Lord. After some deliberation, the crew decided to choose the astronaut with the most experience, which was not Peter Quill. In a not-so-heroic turn of events, Peter decided to take the mantle for himself by shooting and beating up any crewmates that got in his way, in hopes of forcefully becoming the chosen one. So yeah, Peter is a huge dick in this comic. Strangely, his plan worked, and he was instantly teleported away before a firing squad could take him out. He then appeared before an entity known as the Master of the Sun, who granted Peter the abilities of the Star-Lord. Peter could now fly and was gifted elemental guns. So yeah, a much different origin for Peter, and one I'm glad they've since changed. Our next suit is sort of related to that origin, and that's the Sun-Lord outfit. This suit featured in a 2020 Guardians of the Galaxy comic, seemingly trying to blend Peter's first origin story with more modern ones, having him become the Master of the Sun. Our next comic suit is Social Lord, which is from a Guardians of the Galaxy run from 2017. This comic features a moment that was also referenced in the game as an early job that the Guardians did together, which was to rob the planet Setopia. Setopia was said to be impossible to steal from, but Rocket proved them wrong by building a rocket ship that looked like Galactus, scaring off all the planet's inhabitants, buying them some time to steal what they needed. Lastly is Sleek Lord from the 2013 Guardians run. This is a pretty cool suit that I might actually like more in the game than in the comics. This comic series is also the one that introduces us to Peter's father, Jay-Sun, and even has Iron Man join the Guardians for a few issues, so another fun series that I'd recommend reading after the game. There are also a couple original outfits that we haven't discussed yet. One of them is the City Lord outfit, featuring a sleeveless Star-Lord. There's also the Bad Lord outfit, which I've definitely struggled to use continuously for an extended period of time. But next, let's look at Rocket's outfits. His don't offer too much variety compared to the others, but there are three that have some fun comic roots. The first is his Hero of Half-World suit, which is from his first comic series. It's pretty satisfying wearing the suit in Nowhere while in Manilow's bar, since Bill Manilow was the writer who created Rocket and wrote that series. There's also the Smuggler outfit, which is from the same issue where the Guardians did their heist on Setopia. Last is my favorite Rocket suit, the Stinger. This is from a solo Rocket Raccoon comic run and is basically a heist series, with Rocket putting together a team to break into an impenetrable vault. It's a fun series and written in a unique way to match the heist theme. Moving on to Groot, he has some good comic outfits too. The first is his outfit from the Annihilation Conquest story, as we saw when discussing Star-Lord's matching outfit. Then there's the Impaler look, which has a lot of sharp bark protruding out, including a bark mohawk. It's a pretty awesome design and comes from the 2019 Guardians of the Galaxy series. To match his sharp design, Groot's personality has more of an edge to it as well, with him having more attitude, kind of similar to Teenage Groot in the movies. Lastly is the 5 o'clock Sprouts look. This comes from an Infinity Countdown comic, where Groot was stuck in baby form and absorbed poison to cleanse a cosmic being called the Gardener. As a thank you, the Gardener restored Groot, resulting in the 5 o'clock Sprouts look. We'll next look at Drax's suits. The first comic suit is called Cage Match, which is based on a variant cover of the first issue for the 2015 Drax Solo series. Drax's actual look in that comic features longer, baggier pants with armored boots, which could have been a cool style in the game too. Still, I think the Cage Fighter shorts look great here, and are a fitting choice as an alternate design for our brawler Drax. This next one is credited as the Thanos Imperative suit, although it also closely resembles the original comic design for Drax. As far as the Thanos Imperative comic though, this is the one that I described earlier where Thanos revived from a cocoon and the Guardians had to ally with him to stop the Cancerverse. Drax actually gets to briefly kill Thanos too, which is always fun to see. It was only temporary though, as Thanos rematerialized shortly after, since he was immune to death in that series. Also, I haven't really mentioned it, but each of these suits have little text boxes associated with them described by that character. These provide little in-universe reasons why the character would choose to wear this outfit outside of its actual comic origins. For this one, Drax states that he wore this as funeral garb to honor the memory of his wife and daughter while seeking vengeance, which I thought was interesting. To ruin that though, he then goes on to state that Hovat had trouble containing her feminine urges when he wore the color purple. Next for Drax is the Catathian monk suit. This also appeared in the same issue as the Guardians heist on Setopia. However, Drax's look has more meaning, since at the time of the comic, Drax chose to become a pacifist. As you'd expect, this didn't last too long. Continuing on, next is Gamora. First up is her casual kill suit, which originated in an Infinity Gauntlet series that tied in with the Secret Wars event. I also like the text associated with this one, as Gamora describes that dressing casually can be beneficial during an assassination, allowing her to blend in with a crowd and sneak up on someone before they know it, then disappear just as easily. I always enjoy these dark looks at Gamora's past and her insight as a skilled assassin. She really feels like the deadliest woman in the galaxy. Next is the Black Vortex suit. This ties in with Peter's father once he became the villain Mr. Knife. Jay-Sun sought out the powerful artifact known as the Black Vortex, an object that could grant the user cosmic power. Gamora used the Black Vortex, increasing her power and granting her this awesome outfit. It's easily my favorite look for her in the game, I just wish her cape didn't clip through her so much. Lastly is the Chosen Daughter outfit, originating in a Gamora solo series. I'd recommend reading this one as well, since it features some great art and some interesting insight into the lives of Thanos, Nebula, and Gamora when they lived together. In the game's text for this outfit, Gamora states that it was a gift from her father, including features like noise dampeners and surveillance scrambling within it, making it a great assassin's attire. So a lot of great outfits to choose from, and they all look incredible during gameplay. But that wraps up our look into the collectibles, so now I want to move on to another aspect of the game, the sound design and voice acting. Something I found interesting about this game compared to others is that Eidos-Montreal really focused on finding the perfect actors for each role instead of just finding big name actors to help with marketing. They also made the choice to record the motion capture and voice lines at the same time, which I think was a great idea since the actors were able to voice and react to each other more naturally, which I think comes through in the game. I felt the performances were really strong overall, so next I want to highlight the 5 actors who brought the Guardians to life and look at things that you might have seen them in, and what they've been up to since. In a behind-the-scenes video, cinematic director Daryl Purdy describes why they picked each of these actors, and it's also cool to see how these scenes were shot. We'll start with Star-Lord himself, John McLaren.
John had this adolescent mischievousness, but wrapping around a real heart of gold.
My mom, when the Shatari came, she also died for no reason.
I thought John gave a really strong performance as Star-Lord, and I'll admit, I like this version more than the movies. I think John provides a lot of range to this character and is able to give Peter some very humorous moments, while also providing good emotion and drama. Star-Lord is supposed to be a flawed but charismatic leader, and I get that 100% from John's performance. Outside of the game, John has been in a lot of different TV movies, and recently seems to favor the Hallmark romantic comedy style of films. For example, a 2022 Christmas film titled Sappy Holiday, where he has the lead role. Playing Gamora is an actress named Kimberly Sue Murray, and this was actually her first time doing motion capture work. You wouldn't know it though, because she so effortlessly brings Gamora to life. In the making of clip, Daryl Purdy describes that her performance was so strong during a test run that they kept it into the final game.
Gamora, wait, hold on a sec.
Why? So more children can be sacrificed in the name of Rager's flagged-up church?
Of course not,
Just what, Peter?
And then we took that performance, solved it, and put it into the scene to see if it would actually work in the scene. And luckily, because Kim's a rock star, it worked flawlessly, and it remains in the game to this day.
Outside of the game, you might have seen her in a couple other superhero shows, one of which is from the Titans TV series where she played Lady Vic. Most recently, she's appeared as Kiara in Season 4 of The Boys. Next is Robert Montcalm, who plays Groot. I think many would assume that he has the easiest role, but the Groot role is actually very unique. Robert wasn't just tasked with saying, "I am Groot" a lot, but also placing emphasis on the phrase in different ways each time to try and illustrate what he's actually saying. He gives a great performance, and it's pretty crazy seeing him embody the character so fittingly.
Not only can he give you a million nuanced versions of I am Groot, but physically he can embody the character. It's amazing. He just transforms into him. It's wonderful.
I am Groot!
Oh, great!
It was also stated that Groot had around 1,630 lines, all of which being "I am Groot," so it's impressive how well Robert was able to differentiate each of them, and here are a few examples of what I mean.
I am Groot. I am Groot. I am Groot. I am Groot. I'm Groot. I'm Groot. I am Groot.
Can they temporarily unguard it?
Oh no, they take this duty quite seriously. Our only hope of entering is to appeal to their infinite wisdom.
I am Groot.
You must have been lost too, before Rocket and us.
I am Groot. I am Groot. I am Groot.
He's not. He's the sweetest, most...
I am Groot.
No, you don't. This ain't something you can pretend.
I am Groot.
Oh, yeah?
Good thinking. Get the watering sorted out before we go.
I am Groot. am Groot.
He looks so sad, swishing around in his robes.
What'd he say?
Groot wants to water the Grand Unifier.
Oh, right.
The Grand Humidity!
I am Groot.
Another thing I found interesting about the Groot role is that Robert was given a script detailing what Groot was actually saying during each I Am Groot, to better help him voice the line accurately. This also meant that he knew how accurately Rocket translated Groot for the other characters, and apparently, Rocket used the translations to serve his own needs, which Robert described during an IGN interview. What's funny is, Rocket wouldn't always translate what I was saying, purposefully, because he would want to get his own way on something I perhaps disagreed with him on, so I would just keep staring at him after he would give a mistranslation of what I meant. I really wish we could see the script with all the different Groot lines laid out, but still, knowing that Rocket occasionally lies about what Groot says makes it fun to go back and play the game to try and spot those moments. As far as Robert Montcalm himself, he's also credited with lending his voice to other games such as Outlast Trials, Assassin's Creed Origins, For Honor, and Outsiders. Since we mentioned Rocket a bit, let's next discuss his actor Alex Weiner.
He had this really kind of scratchy rawness to his voice. He just had an edge to him, which was exactly what we were looking for Rocket.
Luckily, I know a guy on Nowhere has got the parts we need, and he can get rid of that Nova tracker cheap.
Rocket seems to be somewhat of a tough role because he can be so antagonistic, especially earlier in the game. Alex describes that being a challenge, not wanting Rocket to be too unlikable. I will admit though, Rocket was definitely frustrating me quite a bit during my first playthrough, but I softened to him later on, as well as on subsequent playthroughs. So I think Alex did a good job, and I ended up liking his portrayal of Rocket quite a bit. As far as Alex's other roles, Guardian seems to be his most recent credit on IMDb, but he seems to have a role in the upcoming film The Legacy of Cloudy Falls, playing the role of Brick. Last but not least is Drax actor Jason Cavelier. I've mentioned earlier how impressed I was with the portrayal of Drax in the game, and I think he ended up being my favorite character. There's a great physical presence about him, displaying both intimidation and warmth, which I credit a lot to Jason's performance.
What was great about Jason, who we found for Drax, was he was a stuntman. So I could talk to Jason on a purely physical standpoint sometimes, where it wasn't about what the character was feeling or the line. It was more like, I need you to try to hit this pose or try to be in this physical space.
Believe it or not, Drax wasn't Jason's first superhero performance, which instead was actually Batman. On YouTube, you can find a couple short fan films featuring him as Batman, which I'll have linked in the description. One of which is a steampunk version called Batman 1888. The other is another short film called Son of Gotham. Of the two, I'd recommend Son of Gotham since the Batsuit looks awesome and there's actually a pretty solid fight scene in it as well. But yeah, Jason was Batman before Drax, and I think he was actually pretty good in the role. He's also credited with stunt work in X-Men Days of Future Past, and more recently, he's played the role of Marquand in the crime drama To Catch a Killer. The behind-the-scenes video also highlights the actress who played Nikki, Roman Denis, and I can totally see why, since she's able to give some very memorable and emotional performances as Nikki. I also found it interesting that her age and size helped her get the role. She was 21 years old, but around 5 foot tall. It stated that she could play a 13-year-old well, but her age helped her give the maturity to pull off that character.
I need things to go back to how they were, even if it means making the same stupid game for all stupid eternity. Just the thought that she might come back is better than admitting that she never will, and then it's all my fault.
Another unique aspect of this game is how big of a role music plays in it. We talked about it a lot in part 1, but I just want to highlight again the lengths Eidos Montreal went to give the game its rock and roll identity. The main one being that they were willing to compose a full-length album for the fictional band Star-Lord. Even better is that the album is actually incredible. I'm not lying when I say there are multiple tracks that have remained on my personal playlist since the game came out. I can't believe how good the music is. I'd honestly love a sequel to the game just in hopes that we could get a second Star-Lord album. If you haven't listened to any of it outside of the game, I definitely recommend checking out some of the other tracks. Zero to Hero even has a really fun animated music video that's equally as cheesy as it is badass. I'll have it linked in the description as well for those of you who'd like to watch it. It looks like the guys behind the band wanted to keep the music going beyond the game too, creating their own band called Devil on the Run, with one single already released called Believer. I'll have it linked in the description as well. Unfortunately, they haven't released anything in close to a year, so I hope it hasn't been abandoned already. Although the optimist in me hopes it's because they've been busy working on a second game. Just let me dream. I also really liked how licensed music was incorporated into the game. They're infused into certain cutscenes, and casually listening to them on the Milano surprisingly set a great background atmosphere for hanging out on the ship. Also adding to the atmosphere is the game's original soundtrack, composed by Richard Jacques. I'm not sure I can play any of them in this video, unfortunately, but my overall thoughts are that the scores fit the game very well and positively added to the atmosphere of each level. They also seamlessly fit in with the Star-Lord band music, as well as the licensed music, making everything feel very cohesive from an auditory perspective. Nothing felt out of place, and nothing felt in contrast to the tone of the game. So overall, I loved every aspect of the sound design, from the main cast to the small alien roles voiced by metal singers, and the music contributed nicely to the overall vibe. I personally believe that the three biggest strengths of this game are the story, performances, and the music, so I have no complaints about the sound design. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is one of those hidden gem kind of games. I think when it was first announced, it caught a lot of people by surprise, and was then released only a few months after its reveal, so it showed up pretty abruptly and without a ton of fanfare. From what I've seen discussed online, it was also overshadowed by its fellow Square Enix Marvel game, Marvel's Avengers, and overshadowed in a negative way. Like I mentioned earlier, Avengers had a terrible reputation, one I don't agree with, but that reputation seemingly tainted Guardians of the Galaxy, leading players to quickly write it off. That's a huge shame, because this game contains some of the best writing I've ever seen in a Marvel game, and it's become one of my favorite Marvel games of all time. I wasn't even a huge Guardians fan coming into it, but this game made me into one. So it winning Narrative of the Year feels absolutely deserved, which is partially why I spent so much time walking through the story in this video. It's clear that the writers spent a lot of time and energy nailing down each of these characters and their backstories. Not only that, but intricate details of their personalities, like their hobbies, their quirks, and also their vulnerabilities and weaknesses. This is a writing team that didn't half-ass anything in the story. Everything has a why and reason, and sometimes they aren't made apparently obvious. I like this depth, and I think it adds a lot to the replay value of the game. You can play it multiple times and still learn new things about these characters. It's a fully fleshed out world, and that's a big reason I'm so desperate for this game to get a sequel. They built such an incredible foundation that I feel like it would be such a waste for this to be a one and done game. There's so much more to learn about these characters and so many questions left unanswered. How did Thanos survive? What happened to Nova? And where the hell did Jack Flag go? There's a lot more to explore in this universe, and I think it really needs to continue its story. So I was gutted to see reports stating that the game didn't sell well. It's frustrating to watch something that so deserves to thrive and be embraced by everyone be written off and fly under the radar. I feel like in a lot of ways, Midnight Suns has gone through a very similar experience. It's another game that might not get a sequel, even though it's a unique and quality experience that should get to continue forward. At the very least, players that give Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy a chance seem to enjoy it. And during an Embracer financial report in 2022, they stated that Guardians had reached 8 million players and counting during its first year of release. Sales figures weren't reported, but it seems the game has had a strong player base and continues to find new players. To wrap up though, Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is a phenomenal experience, radiating with fun and energy. It's a hugely creative game, and you can tell that everyone involved had a blast contributing to it. I've replayed it multiple times now, and I know I'll play through it again multiple times after this, because I love being in this world so much and being part of the Guardians. If you haven't played it for yourself, I highly recommend it. It's such a fun ride with a lot of heart, and I can't compliment it enough. If you're like me and want more Guardians of the Galaxy after this game, I have a few things in the description to hopefully help scratch that itch. Things like the game's prequel novel, detailing Peter's time on Mercury, as well as other moments prior to the game. There's also the art book, which is not only visually stunning, but also contains interesting details on the game, many of which I didn't discuss in the video. There's also no shortage of Guardians comics to check out, but I'd recommend starting with either the Abnett and Lanning run or the Annihilation Series if you want something that pairs nicely with this game. Although I have some other comics that we've discussed throughout the series listed in the description as well. But I think that wraps up my thoughts on Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. Man, this was a long series of videos, so I really appreciate you hanging out with me throughout all of it. I've had a lot of fun combing through this game, so I hope you enjoyed it too. Coming up next on the channel though is a highly requested game, Ultimate Spider-Man. It's one I've been meaning to do for a long time, so I think it's finally time to dive in. So expect that coming up in the near future. But I think that concludes today's video, so thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.